Poor people who have dated rich people. What did you learn? Story 1. My ex-wife had a grandfather who was a multi-millionaire. Christmas time at their house was like being in another world. All of the different family members would try to get a moment with the king and flatter him as much as possible. I spent my time down on the ground playing with my kids and was happy to get out of there. About a week or two after the second Christmas, I got a phone call from Grandpa. He wanted to know what he could do for my family. I told him I didn't want any of his money and I would like my kids to know their great-grandfather. Later that year, he showed up at our place unexpectedly and spent most of the afternoon telling stories with me about his youth. He set up a trust fund for each one of my kids to have their college paid for a little bit after that. He told me that out of all of his in-laws, I was the only one who never asked him for anything but to be himself. The age-old struggle with cash, separating the real from the gold diggers. Who's in it for you, and who's in it for the green? Story 2. They don't really have a concept of how rich we are. My ex-boyfriend was wealthy, but had a complex about how he was super poor. It was because all of his friends were also so wealthy, and he was maybe marginally less rich than some of them. He considered himself on the lower end of the scale. They don't really have a point of reference for how poor some people are. When we were together, I was living on a food budget of $100 a month, and he absolutely could not wrap his head around how a person could spend that little. I also have a friend who complains about money, but she is very wealthy. I was rich as a kid, but now I am very poor due to poor family business decisions made by my uncle and my dad. Sometimes our conversations are a bit weird for me. She would casually say, I want someone in my life that can be as sporadic as me when we are bored. We can go to Italy for the weekend, just like that, with no thinking. Sometimes I reply, you are looking for a rich guy then, because I am sporadic, but to go on a trip, I have to plan it for months. And she would start saying, it is just you don't understand. Those trips are not that expensive. One time she told me how she needs the new iPhone and new AirPods. It happens every time she wants something. She feels somewhat guilty because she doesn't need it. On day 1, and when I told her that my phone was my mom's and was 4 years old with a broken screen, she would say she feels bad for needing to buy stuff because she doesn't know how I do it. Then I laughed and told her it was easy when you don't have anything to spare. Then she felt bad for me and bought me $300 worth of clothes instead of the new AirPods. Or my favorite, we were talking about how Apple is why the consumerist mentality is bad, and she told me that if she were to buy me an Apple Mac for $2,000 right there, if I were to say yes, I would, and she proceeded to tell me how there is no difference between us and that I also have a consumerist mentality. Then I proceed to make her feel guilty because offering $2,000 worth of a PC for free to a poor person is not the same as buying Apple products on day 1 because you like them. Story 3. I learned just how productive having money can be. Something needs to be fixed or replaced, we can afford to. Want to do something fun or adventurous? Sure, let's do it now. Want to eat healthier? We can afford all the ingredients. Like, what do you mean your life isn't slowed down by a million different things that need fixing, upgrading, replacing, or being saved for? I remember as a kid, our appliances would always die. We never owned a house, we just rented, and for some reason back then, you had to bring your own washer or dryer. Seeing my mother, with 4 kids, stressed over the dryer dying again and how she was going to swing the laundromat was something I'll never forget as a kid. I married a guy from a well-off family and was blown away when he wanted to replace our dish towels because they were looking ratty. Like, dude, we use these until they disappear. We don't just replace perfectly good dish towels. The new dish towels were ridiculously frivolous to me. Story 4. I dated a man who didn't work, lived off a trust fund. Oddly, he could afford nearly anything. Nothing had any value. He'd buy a $400 KitchenAid mixer and burn it up making Christmas candy the first week. If he decided to make more candy, he'd just go buy another $400 mixer. Nothing meant particularly anything to him. Nothing had value to him, so he didn't treat anything well or try to keep it nice. Why wash Pyrex when you can just throw it out and buy more? Didn't do the laundry and run out of clothes? Just buy more. Someone is mad at you for making a rude remark? I'll just buy you something nice and expect you to forgive me. Our relationship didn't last long because of his behavior. He didn't respect anything or anyone because he could just buy the newest version. He treated people the same way. And the food waste. If they want pasta, they don't just order a bowl of takeout pasta, they'll order 3 different pasta entrees for a variety, a couple of appetizers, and tiramisu since we're already doing the Italian theme. And oh, the cannoli looks good. Let's get a few of those. On a random Tuesday, they'll have half the menu delivered to their front door, and they don't even eat the leftovers because the next day they'll get another feast delivered. I knew a dude like that once. Loaded but didn't value anything, not even friendships. Sometimes having it all means having nothing that really matters. Story 5. How real the network or bubble of it is. It's like the other side of the "it's expensive to be poor" concept. It's this weird internal community of people with money and thus power who are willing to make things happen as long as you're in. I mean, I would meet people at a fundraiser or something, and 5 minutes later, they're happy to make a call that will get me a job at some huge firm. Or like my then boyfriend would say, "Let's go to this concert. Tickets are $180, but it's okay because a friend's parents have a box, so we'll just join them." Or even one time the dishwasher in our flat broke, but we didn't have to pay a dime for repairs because his friend from high school's parents own the building, so they're fixing it for free as a favor. A friend who grew up very modestly in middle class married a man who insisted their children attend the fancy private school he went to. She always thought it was silly since the town they lived in had a very good school district and the schools were much closer. But they went to a private school, graduated, and went to college. As she was entering her senior year, the daughter was looking for a summer internship in her field. She called a friend from high school whose father worked in that field. Before the day was out, she had an internship with his office. No interview is necessary. Later, my friend said that's why he wanted them to go there. The network. Story 6. My ex was having problems with roommates at the university. Her parents bought a $300,000 condo for her to stay in while she finished her degree, 2 years. They sold it for a profit immediately after. I can't imagine not only being able to solve my problems with money, let alone make more of them. She also assumed her family was lower middle class because she didn't live in a mansion like her friends. She was very humble and was smart with her money, but it was very clear she could just call her parents if something didn't work out. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling to pay rent, meaning I was their fallback, not the other way around. There are actually condo buying services that do this for rich people. Basically, you send your kid out of state and immediately buy a condo through this service. Then they live there, with or without roommates, it depends on how rich you are, through college. After some time, the student switches to in-state tuition and then finishes school. When they're done, the company just happens to have a buyer ready to go for you to sell to. A friend of mine sold his condo to the parents of a student a few years ago for nearly $400,000, sight unseen. I just knew it was close to campus and had indoor parking for the kids' Benz. Story 7. They have no concept of what a workday is. My parents and my sister are like this. My dad started his own firm, but for the last 30 years he's been the owner, not the boss. And in the last 20, it's done well enough that he's now minor league wealthy rather than well off. My sister has never worked, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. They will constantly plan family vacations for all of us and be utterly shocked when me and my wife can't just take 3 weeks off to go to Australia with them. But we'll pay, they'll whine, which is lovely. They're very generous, and I'm on easy mode because of them, but not understanding that it's not always about the money. Story 8. I grew up poor, now middle class, and at 18 dated a super rich guy. The first thing I noticed was the food. Not just quantities, but I also discovered so much food, like oysters, fresh fish, olives, etc., that my parents could never buy. I also had to learn etiquette, like which cutlery to use at a really fancy restaurant, and how to use it, how to make polite conversation, how to dress for different parties or occasions. There was just a lot of stuff I never thought twice about. One example was at a restaurant where we got a menu and there were no prices on the menu, so I asked for another one. It turns out, women get menus without prices because it's the men that pay, but the moment you ask, everyone knows you don't belong. I was a pretty shy girl, polite and all that, but I always felt out of place because there were so many little things to be aware of. It's very easy to make a faux pas. My parents brought me up well. I read books all the time, was a decent student, and was a well-behaved kid. But the way his family interacted was so different. I had to learn a lot of unwritten rules that I wasn't aware of. I think in the end, what I actually learned was that even though my childhood was rough, the amount of stress of not having enough money has probably impacted me for life. I valued my parents so much more. Once I had seen what life was like for rich people, I was just so proud of my family for making it work with so much less. This girl dove into a whole new world of dating. It was tough, but it also made her appreciate her roots even more. Dude, if you dig these kinds of stories, smash that like button and subscribe to my channel. I've got tons more for you. Story 9. The difference between having money and having wealth. You grew up poor, worked hard, and finally got $10,000 in the bank, and your income keeps you afloat. Cool. But that is nothing compared to a 50-acre family farm with a couple houses on it and several generations of inheritance that will fall in your lap someday. Family business or family connections to lucrative opportunities. Savings, investments, cash hidden in safes, piles of gold jewelry. Also, owning cars you don't even need or ever drive. Hordes of stuff are sitting around because you never had to move or sell stuff to buy food. Lines of credit being thrown at you. If they suddenly lost all their checking and savings accounts, they'd still be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and wouldn't have to worry even for a second about where their next meal would come from. Story 10. Coming from the other side of this, one of the people who is closest to my heart grew up in poverty, spent some time in prison when he was young and foolish, and even today he barely scrapes by in our high cost of living area, even though he is extremely hard-working and does his best. He was born and raised here. I'm a transplant. Me, on the other hand, I come from relatively recent generational wealth, grew up in an extremely nice area, never wanted for anything, checking the bank balance before big purchases was never a thing, and I have a trust fund that I probably won't have access to until I'm in my 30s, and even then, only in small chunks at a time, because my dad is incredibly neurotic and controlling when it comes to money. A therapist of his he saw for approximately 3 minutes made noises about obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which describes him in frighteningly accurate detail, but who knows. My friend does not understand how I could still have a rocky relationship with my parents even though we have money. It's like it doesn't compute in his brain that money only fixes emotional problems if you use it to pay for and stick with a therapist. Growing up rich does not mean you grow up without any issues, and rich people can still be victims of generational trauma, which they then inflict on their children. We don't really talk about my family or upbringing anymore because every time the subject comes up, and I try to share something that was painful or that sucked about growing up in my house, his brain buffers and he goes into denial mode. So yeah, no amount of money can make you forget your mommy or daddy issues. It definitely can't make you forget that you have a crappy extended family who's toxic and unpleasant company, making your brain feel like it's being bathed in battery acid whenever you're in close proximity to them. Mommy and daddy issues still happen regardless of your socioeconomic status. Someone's socioeconomic status shouldn't be used to erase their history of trauma or ill treatment. And, like I stated before, money only fixes emotional issues if you use it to work with someone who can unpack them. Story 11. That we're hardly even playing the same game, never mind the same rules. I dated a girl with old money and generational inherited wealth. Grandpa's money, some corporate bigwig banker or something to that effect. I don't think her father ever worked a day in his life, and her mother clearly came from money as well. Outside of her, I found every one of her family members out of touch and completely unrelatable. I got really good at biting my tongue when my ex's siblings would complain about not getting a new car for their birthday when last year's model was sitting in the driveway. They had no concept of the value of money and never had to do anything for themselves to get what they wanted. I wasn't exactly poor growing up, but for the most part, if it wasn't strictly necessary for survival, I didn't have it. It was really eye-opening how everything was taken for granted. Those specific people would be helpless in the real world if they lost all their dough. I think this is the reason those types of rich people dislike the poor so much. They subconsciously become aware of their own utter helplessness and unearned entitlement around them, and it scares the ever-loving crap out of them. And fear leads to hate, etc. Story 12. Dated a girl for 3 years who came from old money. She was fine, but her family was beyond out of touch with the real world. They were nice people, but incredibly removed from the rest of the world. They looked at me like I was a zoo animal, in the sense that they were so curious about my life and family, They'd asked me what it was like to go to a public school, how my parents immigrated. They were baffled that not everyone had vacation homes or traveled a lot. The most interesting thing is that old money is much more powerful than new money. They belong to these clubs, which consist of other rich families, and the influence they had was mind-blowing. Want to build a factory in an area not zoned for it? Within a week, that was changed. Wow, even among the rich, classism is alive and kicking. Story 13. I've thought about this a lot as someone who grew up poor, but has been in a number of relationships with women from upper or upper middle class castes. I think what it boils down to is that they have a kind of certainty in the idea that things will work out for them that I don't. Growing up, I felt like we were always on the precipice of catastrophe. I always felt that one wrong move would result in us losing our house or all of our money. As such, I kept immaculate care of the things I bought, knowing that I could not replace any of them if they were gone. The women I've been in relationships with, though, seem to have none of this fear. They always assume that things will work out. Plans don't need to be made because there's always some way to solve a problem with money. Objects don't get much respect because they're always readily replaceable. I always think about Nick Carraway's quote from The Great Gatsby. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money. Their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. Story 14. He didn't have any concept of saving money. It was always just there because his money was always earning money. Having money was an income stream in itself. Also, he had no concept of how much anything would cost. I was going to get some groceries for dinner, and he gave me $300 to pick up some basics. Story 15. Being rich can't cure alcoholism. Dependency is the worst. Having money to spend means you have resources to go to therapy or other services, sure. But that's not what a booze-muddled brain is going to spend money on. Not worrying about finances, it's hard to resist the temptation to waltz down to the liquor store. Hell, you can even make a second trip later. You can afford it. Honestly, the times that I improved my condition the most were the times I had a negative bank balance and a bag of rice for 2 weeks. I can't trust my brain to not make bad decisions when they're available to me. Story 16. I only ever dated one guy who had lots of money. So this is anecdotal, but he was very sensitive about who paid for what. He was quite concerned about potentially being taken advantage of, so we ended up mostly splitting everything 50-50. We missed out on doing some fun stuff he wanted to do, shows, trips, etc., because I couldn't afford half. He seemed mildly resentful of my not making enough money to match him on these things. It was distracting and depressing, and I got tired of feeling like I had to troubleshoot his insecurities. The relationship didn't last long. Let me just say, I do not expect either the man to pay for everything or the person who has substantially more money to pay for everything. I think splitting the costs of shared expenses is fair, but it does mean that those expenses are limited by the wallet of the person with the smaller income. In my experience, people with comfortable, as opposed to large incomes, tend to be much more relaxed about income disparity and are more willing to offer to close gaps. Story 17. Quality really does make a difference in everything, from clothing to ingredients. I grew up poor-ish, had a stable shelter and clean, used clothes, but anything else was a struggle. I had a friend in college whose dad was a VP at a major box store. They were doing all right. The first time I went to their house, she suggested having a sandwich to hold us off until dinner time. Her regular snack was a prosciutto and arugula on ciabatta, with a finishing drizzle of balsamic vinegar. I had only seen those words in a fancy cookbook. I added the ish so I didn't have to deal with any we had it worse Olympics. I've still got like 5 aces, even though I grew up in a decent house and always had utilities. I fully acknowledge that it was bad. What's worse is that some of our suffering was unnecessary because my mom thought that social programs should go to those who really needed it, even though we qualified for assistance. Yesterday, a coworker and I were talking about how the economy has been affecting our lives, and she mentioned being working class. I told her we were the working poor. After some thought, she agreed. The past several years have been brutal. Any cushion we had is gone. I feel like a kid again, in the worst possible way. Story 18. If you have a lot of money, people give you so much free stuff all the time, trying to earn your business or procure donations. It is ironic that the people who can best afford to pay for the items get paid the most, because the gift or gesture is likely to pay them back in the long run, while poor people don't really have anything to offer individually. Collectively, they can be a powerful market force. That's why most CEOs present themselves as progressive and consumer friendly, unless your customer base specifically slants conservative. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy rich people who married a poor person. What surprised you? Story 6 is so wild. See you on that video.